Korean War. I got to assume that you did, some research on that as well, because it was, like I said, it was pretty detailed.
Well, it's kind of funny you should mention that. I had been writing a book on Korea,
Mm-hmm.
and I was bored with it, so I dropped it and wrote Starkweather instead. And so I've still got part of this book on Korea sitting in my desk. But yeah, I've actually studied the Korean War quite a bit because I think it's highly important conflict is totally overlooked.
It is, because everybody talks about the world wars, obviously, and then they talk about Vietnam. But I'm telling you, if you ask a person on the street who's not a veteran or older, they don't remember the Korean War. And again, it's such an important, I don't want to say backdrop, but a piece of information on this whole story. I mean, because it kind of shaped your main character and who he became.
Mm.
Another thing that I wanted to get into also is, the setting. Obviously, we're in Lincoln, Nebraska, 1958. Interesting time for our country, obviously. The 50s were kind of a quote-unquote innocent time, and then you've got the small-town feel also. Talk a little bit about the panic that ensued, from best as you can surmise, again, from what happened there. I mean, you tell it really well, how everybody in town was just terrified.
Well, I think what you got to look at is this is the end of the innocence, and this is where it all comes to an end. Ammunition sales were up high. Stores were just running. This is when you could buy ammo at the gas station, and everybody was selling out of ammo. People were nailing their doors nailing their windows shut. People started locking their doors for the first time in Bennett, which was the area that Starkweather lived in, and all across Lincoln. The kids weren't allowed to go outside at lunch because they were afraid of getting shot by Starkweather. There was definitely a state of panic in Lincoln when all this was going on, no question about it.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that it's when you read the book, that's one of those things that you can automatically pick up on. And the interesting thing about the book too is that this is an establishment of characters, surrounded by real life events, and so that's kind of what keeps you entangled in. You weave an interesting tale, with you've got a romance going on in there, you've got all those things going on. How hard was it to do, a book on true crime, but also, tell a story of someone as well? You know what I mean? You've got something around there.
Yeah, I thought they were going to ask me if I had a secret barber on the side. No, I asked that during an interview the other day. No, it's life. It's just the way life is. Life isn't one thing at a time. It's one day at a time, but it's not one thing at a time. And you're in town. You're a sharp dresser. You're a professional. You're gonna have a girlfriend in Lincoln. And there's a lot of whiskey drinking in there. To me, that's reality. I quit drinking 13 years ago, and but that's the way it was when I was a reporter. And that in itself helped me weave the story together, because 7 or 8 years I spent doing news journalism, and especially covering trials. They pick things apart and put them back together again in a final argument, and that kind of tells you how to lead up a story. It really does. And I learned a lot from murder trials and fraud trials and things like that.
And that's an interesting point you bring up. A lot of the things that you just mentioned are interesting to me, but one of the things that I actually identified with the main character was, and I think I mentioned this last week, I'm not totally sure, but I know I've mentioned it to my wife, the character, and I think a lot of us feel this way in the real world. He does this amazing job of reporting the Starkweather case. Just, absolutely awesome. The type of things that are going to get him promoted to other places and things like that. But it's always, what are you doing for me tomorrow? It's never, thanks for what you did today. It's always, okay, well, that's cool that you did that today. Tomorrow, what you got for me? And I thought that was interesting that you did that because, there are so many of us that have that same, feeling about our jobs that it just really shone through on this book for the main character of it.
Oh, Lord. Well, I'll tell you what. I was a news reporter for about 8 years, and the last year or so I was a managing editor of a paper here in Cincinnati. And, how do I feel about that? Well, it started out really cool, and I was working up in Sandusky, where Cedar Point is, if you're familiar with that. Mm-hmm. Then I moved over closer to Cleveland for a while and covered politics. Met a couple of presidents. It was pretty cool. And a job in Cincinnati came up, and it just didn't work out. It didn't work out. And one day I just decided I'd quit, and I went out and got a job as a construction worker.
Huh. Well, that's your story just now kind of reminds me of the movie Office Space. You know what I mean? It's much simpler to do one thing rather than the other, and I kind of, identify that with that at the end of the day, where you can leave work at work, and with your previous employment, if you're you're doing writing full time, regardless, your job never ends, does it?
I'm sorry.
I was saying, previously, before the construction work, with doing reporting and things like that, your job never ends, does it? It's a 24/7 job, and you convey that with your character.
Yeah. Usually it's not too crazy. I've been called out in the middle of the night on a few times. It's probably the worst night. I got called out on one night about 3 o'clock in the morning. I've been snowing for 8 hours or so up around Sandusky. 3 feet of snow on the ground. Editor calls me up 2 o'clock in the morning. Says, Jeff, there's a train derailment. And I had to walk about a half a mile or so to get to it off in the fields. And the wind was blowing so hard off the lake that it had blown the train off the tracks. And it dumped a whole pile of brand new Lincolns all over the field. And that's the kind of thing you don't really want to do at 3 o'clock in the morning.
I would imagine not. It's funny you talk about that in the book, and then also one of the things that you captured, and obviously in Ohio, especially in the Cedar Point area, Cleveland, all this, the bitter cold of Nebraska in January of 1958, and a little bit of December. That was something that I felt you painted an awesome picture of, and it made me not want to go to Nebraska in the winter. But, it was just one of those things where you could tell you had experience with it. Talk a little bit about that, because, it showed through your words and obviously in the book.
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, I grew up in West Virginia, and it got pretty cold there, and we got a lot of snow. And then I took my job in Sandusky. I lived 4 blocks off the lake. Seriously, 4 blocks. And I could walk to work, which I did often. The winters, which somebody warned me about this, he said the winters up there are just brutal. And I didn't really believe believe it until we had about 2 weeks where it never got above 20 below. And it snowed and snowed and snowed and snowed, and they couldn't get the ice off the streets for weeks. It would just feel like it was going to burn your face off. The wind was just so horrible. Really had to dress for it, and that's the one thing I don't miss about Sandusky. Sandusky's a lovely town. I love it up there. I'd go back, but that cold weather is just awful.
Yeah, it just sounds miserable. Screw negative 20. I don't think I can handle that. You know, it's like going to Minnesota. You know, whenever I watched the Super Bowl over the weekend and they had people outside, I know it was inside, but just to show some of the people outside, you know, trying to get in and things like that, I was like, this looks horrific.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those people are crazy.
Talk a little bit about, see, for me, okay, and this is just for me, obviously I'm not you, and we may see this different ways, but I would feel like it would be kind of a daunting task to talk about somebody like Charles Starkweather. Not so much him, because, again, I said this last week, I don't find him to be that interesting. I find the story to be interesting. But to talk about something that's been talked about so many different times, and to do it in a different way, how did you kind of come up with a way to tell the story that wasn't the same as what's been done before? Because, again, you talked about it. You read so much on it.
Well, I drew from what I read, and I drew from what I knew. And I know journalism, and I like history. And I just thought it would be interesting to have a kind of a new kid on the block covering a story that is running in papers in all 50 states. You know, it just seemed like a good natural fit for me. I've never had a story that scored that big, but everybody wanted Hack's work, and it's hard to describe the feeling. You know, just get your name in print is really cool.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I mean, I would agree. And you know,
getting back to what you were saying, I lost track of what I was talking about there. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I was just saying, you know, to be able to tell this story in a different way than it's been told before. I just thought.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Just basically my reporter's background. I read books on it and studied the different ways that they did it and came up with just a different way, and it just had to be the most natural way I could go.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so, you know, let's go to your reporter background a little bit. If you had the opportunity, obviously we're talking almost 60 years since his death, but if you could sit in a room with Charles Starkweather and ask him some questions, what types of things would you ask him?
Oh, God. Well, I mean, there's certain things about the case obviously I'd like to clear up, but you know, Charles, he doesn't always tell the truth.
Yeah.
Did you notice that? Because I noticed
a little bit. He seemed to be a pathological liar. That's why, you know, everything he said, I was just like, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Who knows?
Well, you know, the first thing he would do, if I asked him, okay, why did you kill Robert Culbert in the Crest gas station on the outskirts of Lincoln? And he would say it was self-defense. Believe it or not, he said the guy pulled a gun on him, so he took it from him and then shot him